Ambassador, if we can just ask you, what are your thoughts about this and why the U.S. has remained relatively silent until this week? We heard President Obama speak just this week.
Well, the United States has a long history of cordial relations with Egypt. I think after Israel, Egypt is a very strong ally of the United States. And the diamond in this relationship, or the jewel in the crown, has been the military-to-military relationship.
Let's talk about the military exercises that President Obama suspended this week.
Yes.
I guess the next question that we have, the F-16 fighter jets, they have also been suspended. They've been grounded. What about that $1.3 billion?
These are just raps on the knuckles, or a slap on the wrist. 4 planes not being given, I don't think the Egyptian military would be terribly affected by that. Neither the exercises. Okay. The real punch will come not only for the ruling generals, because they're, the de facto ruler is General Sisi. They just have a civilian facade right now of, just to give it some international legitimacy. But if you hit them in the pocketbook, that will register. Much more important, in my view, is the effect on international public opinion. Because, the United States, as has been rightly pointed out, would be seen as expressing its moral indignation rather than indulging in pragmatism, so-called pragmatism.
Do you think, Dr. Fahmy, do you think that the U.S. will pull that $1.3 billion? I know it's a big question that everybody's been asking, but do you foresee that happening?
No, and I'll tell you why. The United States, for the first time in the Middle East, is finding itself in a very precarious situation. And it's really about its sphere of influence. Who are the U.S.'s 2 strongest allies in the region besides Egypt? Israel and Saudi Arabia. Israel and Saudi Arabia were the first 2 countries to congratulate the Sisi government. They're extremely content with the foreign policy of the Sisi regime. For the United States to come and not just slap them on the wrist, but withdraw aid would actually put into question our allegiance with Saudi Arabia and Israel. Now let's look at that $1.3 billion in aid. It's in military aid. It's in Chinook helicopters, Abrams tanks, and F-16 fighter jets. The first people who will feel it in the pocketbook are Raytheon, Boeing, Lockheed Martin, and Northrop Grumman. The Egyptian people are not really concerned about that kind of aid. So withdrawing the aid would require us to talk about that semantic game of, is this a coup or is this not a coup? At this point, that's become increasingly irrelevant. It's really about what is the U.S. foreign policy going to be in the region. If we remember during President Obama's first inaugural address, what did he say? He said, to those who reign with tyranny, you are on the wrong side of history. And at that time, we thought he was talking about Egypt. Today, Egypt's further and further away from the right side of history, and the United States has remained silent. And so what we're putting ourselves in question of, are we becoming increasingly loyal to the democratic values that we said we want to promote in the world? Our silence is taking us...
in just a second. But what about, Ambassador, the billions that comes from Arabs that also have been used to support the coup?
Well, the Saudis and the Kuwaitis and the Emiratis, they're really worried about the impact of the so-called Arab Spring. Because right now they've been able to inure themselves largely by giving more and more money to the public so that this kind of unrest does not spread to them. And therefore, for them, General Sisi, if he can control the Egyptians, this would mean that the Arab Spring, in a sense, would be stopped in its track. And that's why they are giving money up to $12 billion worth of pledges so far. Let's see if they really disperse the amount.
Well, let's talk about this money. Let's talk about whatever we want to call this, a coup, we want to call it unrest. Is it leading to civil war? And that question, I'm going to first start with you, Dee Dee. Is it leading?
Yeah, I think, well, they already have a civil war, and what's upsetting is obviously when the Middle East is in turmoil, it's bad for the whole world, which is why I think we need to try to step up more.
What's it mean for the U.S. specifically if they continue?
Well, it's never good. I mean, obviously for all of us, and as far as, our alliances, and you're right, it was just a slap on the wrist. I mean, that's just, that's nothing, what we've done. I don't understand why we're not stepping up, and I don't understand why we're not taking a stronger role, because we want the Middle East to be as at peace as possible, and right now it's getting worse and worse, and what's bad is the Muslim Brotherhood, as well as the military, they're digging their heels in. So you wonder, could there be a third person that could maybe both agree on? I don't know, maybe that's a possibility.
And for you, would you say, I mean, it hasn't been quite long enough to say this is now a full-fledged civil war, but what does this mean for Egypt? What does it mean for the U.S. and what does it mean for the rest of the world? I'll tell you take that, Dr.
I
Fahmy.
think we have to ask ourselves, what is a civil war? A civil war is armed conflict between two factions of society against one another. Right now we're seeing the military and the security apparatus cracking down on civilian population.
Okay.
So in terms of definition, no, this is not a civil war. This is state aggression against a segment of its own population.
Perhaps civil unrest.
Yeah, we can all agree that it's civil unrest.
Again, civil unrest is a segment of society insisting on disturbing the status quo. The violence is state-perpetuated violence against a segment of society. And because the violence is so targeted, we're seeing much of the deaths targeted headshots where people are actually being assassinated in the street. This is much more than civil unrest. This is the elimination of a segment of society. And when we're starting to talk about eliminating a segment of society, we are far, far away from democratic discourse of inclusion. We're going back to authoritarian dictatorship.
Ambassador?
I agree with what Professor Fahmy said. I think the Army's action is quite close to what we call state terrorism. Although General Sisi and the generals are accusing the Muslim Brotherhood of terrorism, but that's a stretch, because a democratically elected government has been removed and the president has been kidnapped and nobody knows where he is. So this action, if it was to go to the International Court, the International Court of Justice, I think the International Court of Justice would restore President Morsi. Of course, it's never going to go there.
Dee Dee,
Well, yeah, interesting, because you're talking about stages of civil unrest, civil war. I mean, I think it's worse than civil war, what you're saying. I don't understand how we're sitting by, idly by it, and let this happen. Because you have the military, I mean, they're killing civilians, they're killing everyone, whoever gets in the way. And, and who knows what the numbers are. So, it just needs to stop one way or the other, and I do think we need to step in and not take this lightly.
Our last question on this topic, what is next for Egypt, and how is there any way to restore the peace there? Dr. Fahmy? I know that's a pretty big question, but
it's a difficult question. The situation in Egypt today is a result of a lot of missteps that have happened since the removal of Mubarak, and we can lay blame in many, many instances. But what is happening today is a critical moment in Egypt's history, but also in U.S. Middle East relations. Absolutely. And we really need to talk about, we were talking very recently about winning hearts and minds. We are now today seeing the undermining of democracy and liberal values, and it's about time we all step up and say, no, we had turned the page in 2008 and said, the future of U.S. foreign relations with this segment of the world, especially in lieu of President Obama's address in Egypt, was going to be built on building democratic civil society and democratic states. And today, that is increasingly a far, far, far vision.
Final thoughts, Ambassador.
I think at this stage, nobody can predict how this very unfortunate, tragic state of affairs, which Egypt, I don't think, has experienced in its modern history, will play out. I hope it's not like the Lebanese situation, where fighting went on for 12, 13, 14 years in the 70s right up to early 90s. This UN Security Council can play a role. There has to be a calibration and rethinking in the United States and in Saudi Arabia. They are allies, the US and Saudi Arabia. I think the Saudis should lay down some markers to the army and not give them carte blanche to go and repress the other side. So yes, a basket of action, I think, is the way to go.
We thank you all for your thoughts, and we'll all be watching, as will the world. We're going to be talking about another controversial issue when we come back, and that has pitted some politicians against New York's police force. Does stop and frisk unfairly target minorities, or does it save lives? Don't go away. Fresh Outlook will take a look at that issue when we come back.